mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, John Gordon, and I got a very special guest, a man who was part of what I consider to be the best team of outdoor writers in newspaper history. And it's no exaggeration. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Houston, Texas area when the Houston Chronicle really put the outdoors as a priority, because it was such a hunting and fishing culture around the city that they knew that their readership, really loved the outdoors and really loved to read about it and all the stories that came from all around the city and the bays and, from Galveston to west to Matagorda and Rockport and everything else. So my guest today is one of those people who was part of that team. Welcome, Shannon Tompkins, to the DU Podcast.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Man, I'm fantastic. Shannon, so glad to have you on. I love talking about the Houston area history. I did a podcast with a mutual friend of ours, Rob Sawyer, wrote that 100 Years of Texas Waterfowling book. One of the, really the definitive work on, a lot of the Texas waterfowling history.
It is.
And because, you're also friends with him, we met up at Spread Oaks Ranch and had, I think immediate connection, because we both love this stuff so much. And I thought, when we did kind of a high-level overview with Rob, so let's dive into it deep with Shannon Tompkins, a man who lived it. He was right in the middle of it, of the east side of Houston. And for the listeners, Shannon, define the east side of Houston and where we're talking about.
Well, basically between Houston and the Louisiana border on the Sabine River, it's probably about 100-mile, 120-mile stretch, basically from Galveston Bay to the Sabine Lake border. Just it's kind of a confluence of several different ecosystems of piney woods, the freshwater marshes, saltwater marshes, river mouths, bays. It's the country between, Chambers County, Jefferson County, Liberty County, just east of Houston.
Right. And we talked about that before as the reason why there were so many ducks and geese there was that real habitat diversity. You had everything a duck or goose would ever need in that area, so they came there by the millions, really, at the heyday.
Exactly. It's a major traditional wintering area.
Exactly. Located next to one of the largest cities in America. And that's something also that's kind of fascinating of Houston, Texas, and its role in this, once again, from the east to the west side. There's really no other city like it, I think, in my estimation, in waterfowling history that has so many characters and so much habitat around it. Give the listeners an idea of why the city of Houston really grew into what it is now, the fourth largest city in America.
Yeah, Houston's kind of unique. It sits right on the edge of like 3 or 4 different ecosystems. It's like you said, it's the fourth largest city in the U.S. There's a little more than 7.5 million people there right now, which is, to give people some perspective, that's the population of Louisiana and Mississippi in that one concentration. But it was. It's just serendipity. That's where all the rail lines came together back in the late 1800s, and that's oil came in the 1900s, and Houston just grew. And it's the fourth largest city. Got one of the biggest ports in the country, and it's just an incredibly big area.
It's the truth, man. I growing up on the east side in Kingwood. I've watched the city explode over the last 2 decades to where, places like Cleveland, Texas, and New Caney and Porter and stuff like that were in the middle of nowhere in the country, and the city has completely swallowed them up now at this point.
Exactly. I grew up in Baytown, which is probably, 60 miles east of downtown Houston. It was a little city of about 18,000 people. Houston might as well have been the other side of the world when I grew up there. And I just happened to grow up in a town that was consumed with waterfowl because we're in the perfect spot.
There's some real characters, that we're going to get into that we're all from Baytown. And a lot of them, because, Baytown was an oil town. Am I correct?
Right.
A refinery town. That's what really drew everybody there. It was work. And it was the jobs. Humble Oil, I believe, which became Exxon later on, is really built Baytown. I think in 1917, I believe was the date that everybody recognizes as the forming of Baytown as a company town. And so a lot of these folks who were guides, outfitters, and everything all started out in the oil industry.
A lot of them did, but a lot of them were from the old families around Baytown and the surrounding areas that just old farming and ranching communities is where a lot of those folks came from, and that's where their history is from.
Right. I'm just going to say some names of some different locations, and you give me some thoughts about their history and what they meant to waterfowling in that area. The Jackson Ranch.
Jackson Ranch was one of the biggest in Chambers County. Chambers County is kind of an interesting place. We talked before. I'm not sure if it's still true now, but there used to be more alligators in Chambers County than people. But it was
that's an interesting fact.
and it's the county right next to Harris, which is what Houston's in. Right. So that's kind of interesting. But the Jackson Ranch, the JK Ranch, is what it was back in the day. One of the biggest ranches in Chambers County. There was all those ranches: the Jackson, the Barra, the White, the Mays, all those ranches started out as cattle ranches as far back as the 1820s. So the Jackson Ranch was one of the biggest ones. It was a combination of coastal prairie, freshwater and then intermediate marsh and piney woods. It was just all these different ecosystems came together, and it was very good for cattle raising and really good for waterfowl.
And some real characters, the Jackson family. Anybody named Elmer Crackcorn Jackson is that you just immediately think, man, what's that guy's story?
Crackcorn was about my grandfather's age, so I'm guessing he was probably born around 1905, somewhere right in there. Part of the Jackson family. Crack was one of the best cowboys I ever knew in my life. But he was also a guide, and he guided on the Bear Ranch, guided on the Jackson Ranch, but he guided for Joe to go on the Bear Ranch, and he and Joe were just best of friends, and Crack was probably one of the best shots and one of the best men I ever knew in my life. Grew up on a horse and in the marsh, and I can't think of a better way to grow up.
Oh, man, it's incredible, and I know his nephew Rufus was also somebody you were close to.
Right. Rufus was his nephew. I guided on the Bear Ranch back in the early mid-'70s for a few years, and Rufus and I worked together a lot, and I learned a ton from those guys, just as I did from just everybody I was around over there.
I got you. All right. Here's a place that you just mentioned, too, as well, and to give people perspective of what the Barrow Ranch meant to Eastside waterfowling. Numbers I got from Rob's book in 1979, 20,000 hunters came through the gates, taking over 19,000 geese and 18,000 ducks. Ralph Barrow, and then later, of course, Joe Legault, and we're going to get into those people more in depth. But they offered, people a place to hunt at a reasonable price, and some of the most incredibly, great hunting land in the history of the U.S. was down there in those marshes as far as waterfowling went. So the Barrow Ranch is, firmly cemented as one of the, the great historical places in that area. So, just give us a little Barrow Ranch history, Shannon, if you will.
Well, the Barrow Ranch was adjacent to the Jackson Ranch, kind of on in Chambers County, right at the back end of East Galveston Bay. It was probably about the area that was hunted was about 25,000 acres. It was a combination of coastal prairie, rice fields, a lot of rice back then, some freshwater marsh and an intermediate marsh, and it was open to the public. I think that started back in, I want to say, the 20s with Ralph Barrow.
Yeah, once again, according to Rob's book, 1928.
Yeah, it was open to the public for a day fee. I think it started out at like a couple of bucks a day or something.
$2.
Like that. Folks would line up outside the gate off the farm to market road, pay their $2, and the ranch was open to them. And you could hunt the rice fields, you could hunt the marsh, and the marsh at Barrow Ranch was legendary.
Yeah, I experienced it, man, as a kid, and it's really hard to describe to people, I think, what that marsh was like. I mean, sinking up to your knees might be a kind term for it. I mean, I could see where you could just get lost and never come back out of there.
Well, and a lot of people did. Prior to when I started hunting there in the late '60s, that whole marsh was all the wetlands from the freshwater. It was kind of like Neapolitan ice cream. You had freshwater, then going to intermediate, then going to salt marsh. But it was all covered in sea cane. So that made it even more of a maze for people.
Yeah, that cane was all over the place, and I can remember from the early 80s. Right.
Well, and people used to get lost in there. But yeah, it was just a wonderland for waterfowlers because you had an incredible amount of habitat, access to it for a reasonable rate, and you were left to your own devices for the most part. Now there were a handful of guides that would take people, but it was one of those places where it was kind of like a lot of public areas. Now there really were no public areas in Texas for a long time. So places like the Barrow Ranch, the Pipkin Ranch, to a lesser extent the Jackson Ranch, and some of the other ones gave the public access to some of the best waterfowling in Texas. And I can remember opening day at the Barrow Ranch would have been somewhere in the mid-'70s, where 500 people went into that ranch on opening day.
Yeah, and but it's not a situation like you run into public land here in this area where everybody's on top of each other. The place was so big, that you could really, that was 500 people, and not overly crowded by any means.
On 25,000 acres,
right?
So, but yeah, it was it was pretty famous in Texas, and drew just a lot of people from the Houston area to the east side. That's where a lot of people from Houston got their baptism under fire.
That's right. It's I mean, once again, experiencing that marsh firsthand, I'm glad I did, because it really gave me an idea of the kind of work that it was going to take to become a really skilled waterfowl hunter, and I wasn't swayed by it.
Right.
And I think that was a big thing, because I think it was a lot of people who probably ended up down there, never went back, duck hunting, just thinking, man, that's too much.
Right.
And
yeah, I thought that a few times myself.
And a lot of the Barrow, well, at least a big part of the Barrow Ranch today is Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge, down there. So it's still the same marsh country that it was.
Right, and it's still open for public waterfowling, parts of it.
Right.
And the same thing with the Jackson Ranch. A large part of the Jackson Ranch was the original tract for the Anahuac Wildlife Refuge. And that's what's happened to a lot of those historic ranches on that side on the east side of Houston, from the Jackson to the Barrow to the McFadden Ranch.
Right. And that became Sea Rim State Park, am I correct?
Well, it became McFadden National Wildlife Refuge.
Right.
Parts of all that country over there in Jefferson County became, Sea Rim State Park, Texas Point Wildlife Refuge, the J.D. Murphy Wildlife Management Area. A lot of that stuff on the east side of Houston is now basically protected, a lot of it. And then you have the Wallaceville Project, which is owned by the Corps of Engineers, which is the mouth of the Trinity River, which is a completely different world.
Yeah, that's something I'm going to talk about too, the Trinity River bottoms, because it's more like Mississippi, Arkansas type, flooded timber lakes versus the marsh country. So that's really created, like I said, a really diverse habitat base.
Well, that was the thing about the east side of Houston is you had, particularly living where I did, I was within 20 miles of some of the best timber hunting in the state. The largest cypress swamp wholly in Texas is along the lower Trinity River. So it's a lot of it's a lot like the Delta, the Mississippi Delta country, and a very, very similar culture in there. And then 10 miles away, you switch to the coastal prairie and the marshes, and that's a completely different type of waterfowling and completely different culture. You had all of that within 100-mile range. You had this incredible diversity, and not just that, but you had the mouth of the delta of the Trinity River, which is incredible freshwater marshes, and then you had the spoil banks and sandbars at the mouth of the river, which would just draw tons and tons of geese. So you had all of this. It was just, pick the way you like to waterfowl, and you could do it.
That's it. So you're saying growing up in Baytown opened up a waterfowl wonderland to you pretty much.
Well, it was. It did, and it was just an ingrained culture in that town at the time. I was surrounded by people people who loved to waterfowl hunt. It was at every turn were incredible waterfowl hunters, and a lot of those folks would share their knowledge and their time with young kids like me and a bunch of other folks who ended up becoming waterfowl guides over there. And it was interesting to. I don't think there's any concentration in any town in Texas of more waterfowl guides or folks tied to waterfowl than in Baytown. I mean, from decoy carving to duck calls to just legendary duck hunters came from that town.
Yeah, exactly.
And surroundings.
Exactly. One last location I want to talk about is really famous from the market hunting era is Lake Surprise. Tell us about that.
Lake Surprise is down in Chambers County. It's one of actually about 4 or 5 big freshwater natural lakes in the marsh in Chambers County. Lake Surprise is probably the biggest and obviously the most famous one. It held incredible numbers of canvasbacks. It was one of the top canvasback spots, the top one in Texas, along with Hines Bay farther down the coast. But it was also the site of, market hunting really got its start in Texas, in the Lake Surprise area, because of the demand for canvasbacks. It was covered with eelgrass. Colonel Moody of Galveston fame actually bought it, built a commercial gunning operation on it. They would ship canvasbacks from Lake Surprise to New York, to London, to Chicago, to St. Louis. It was the premier canvasback in the state, and generated some really interesting characters.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then, people equate market gunning for cans, especially with the Chesapeake Bay, but Lake Surprise in that area down there was just as prevalent, and they may have had more canvasbacks than Chesapeake did.
Right. They, I somewhere I've got the numbers about how many they would ship a year, but in the late 1800s, they were shipping tens of thousands of canvasbacks out of Texas.
Yeah, and it's just of course, the canvasback today is not a duck that has big numbers. A lot of it because the fact that the East Coast restaurants served them as one of their great delicacies didn't do the can any favors. And I know it from a DU standpoint at Ducks Unlimited, we've done a lot of work to try to help bring the canvasback populations to their former glory days. Hasn't happened yet, but there's always hope that they're going to really be able to catch hold again.
Well, at least they're holding their own and increasing a little bit, and it's really good to see them. There's still, a fair number around down here. Not anything like back then, but a lot of things have changed.
And we're back, folks, with the DU Podcast. Our guest today, Shannon Tompkins, former outdoor writer and journalist for the Houston Chronicle. How long did you work at the paper, Shannon?
I was a newspaper reporter for 40 years. I worked at the Houston Post, the Beaumont Enterprise, and worked for about I guess it was 30 years at the Houston Chronicle.
Man, you saw a lot in that time frame. 40 years of reporting.
It was an interesting time, and there saw a lot of changes. Got a chance to see some incredible things, work with some wonderful people, to see just the luckiest guy in the world to have been able to do that and to have had that opportunity.
Yeah, and I certainly enjoyed reading your stuff in those days. It's quality stuff, man. Okay, now we're gonna kind of switch gears a bit from places, locations that were really part of the East Side culture to the people. And I want to start out with somebody who was really, I think very close to you. I think you called him a second father. And a man who is really among the waterfowling culture, not only in Houston area, but I think nationwide. And that man's name is Joe Legault.
Mr. Joe. Yeah.
Mr. Joe. I mean, I remember he was up in age by the time I ever got to the Barrow Ranch, and that was 1980, 81 time frame. But he was still sitting there every day, in the shack and talking to everybody and taking the money, and he was one of those characters that I was just fascinated with from the jump. So tell us about your relationship with Joe and how it really started.
Well, Joe Legault, really kind of, I don't know if really wasn't like a father. It's more like a great uncle, I guess.
Gotcha.
But Joe probably influenced more waterfowl hunters than any single person I know in that area. He married into the Barrow family. I think in the 30s. Joe.
I got that. It was 1948. He married Elizabeth Barrow.
Yeah, he came from Dallas to Rice. He played football for Rice in like 1930, and a friend of his, one of his classmates, took him out to hunt the Barrow Ranch, and from there he ended up marrying into the family and basically took over the operation after World War II. Joe was in the service during World War II, came back, began running the ranch, and being a kid in that country, you ran into Joe Legault, and just for some reason he put up with me.
Because I know you guided primarily goose hunts, correct, on the Barrow?
No, actually, both goose and duck hunts.
Goose and duck, yeah.
But that's where I started really learning how to duck hunt and goose hunt, waterfowl hunt, was hunting on the Barrow Ranch. And, I guided there for 2 or 3, 4 seasons, I think, taking hunters there. But Joe was one of those guys, an incredibly sharp guy, and very concerned about conservation. He was involved in DU early on, and had a true conservationist ethic. And he started a lot of things like half-day hunting, rest areas. He truly cared about the resource and truly cared about waterfowl hunters. And I learned a lot Joe Legault and from his kindness, like I said, putting up with a young guy who was just loved waterfowling more than anything else, and gave me every opportunity to follow that dream, I guess.
Yeah, and talking about Ducks Unlimited and Joe Legault, he was, I would, would go, as a kid, my parents and stuff would go to a few different banquets around here and there. One in Cleveland, Texas, and like we talked about that earlier, been swallowed up by Houston at this point. But I remember going to that banquet, and lo and behold, Joe Legault was there.
Yeah.
I think he, ventured to a lot of the events around the city and really kind of put his money where his mouth is, and helped out and contributed and donated. And one thing I remember too, Joe would keep birds at his house, and he had a whole collection of ducks and geese that were cripples or whatever, and he would nurse them back to health and give them a home right there in front of his house, and that was fascinating to go over there and see all the different species of birds right there at Joe's property.
Yeah, it was a menagerie.
Yeah, snow geese and specks and pintails and whatever.
Right, and I would sit there and just listen to some of those birds. That's the way you learn to call, is just listening to those birds. But Joe's influence was a lot wider than just the Houston area. I mean, I can remember looking at Outdoor Life for Field and Stream or Sports Afield back in the day. There would be ads for Peter's shot shells, and it have Joe Legault on it. And so it was not like he was just a regional, I guess, not really celebrity, but I guess he was. But he had national reach too, and he influenced. There were so many of the really, I guess, more higher profile guides came out of that Bear Ranch country than anywhere else.
The popular term these days in football is coaching tree, right? Well, Joe had a guide tree,
Exactly.
And we'll talk about some of those people. Here's a Baytown guy, Gene Campbell.
Gene and Bobby, his brother, went to high school. Gene was, just to tell you what kind of culture I grew up in there in Baytown. Our high school mascot was gander, geese, a big giant Canada goose. But yeah, I went to high school. Gene was about 4 years ahead of me, I think, and his brother Bobby and I are the same age, so we all went to high school together, hung out together. They worked at one of the marine stores there, and Gene became a guide out at Bear's Ranch, and he's still to this day, his Oyster Bow Hunting Club is on what remains of the original Bear Ranch.
Right. I've been really wanting to go over there and hunt with Gene, just because of that fact that it's still that's part of the old barrow.
It's a piece of history, and Gene's one of the best waterfowlers I've ever met, and as all of those guys are, all those people I grew up around are just incredibly skilled and smart people, and Gene's really done a lot of incredible work on that property out there, and as a lot of people have as the years have gone by, and learned how to develop and nurture, native wetlands, natural wetlands, native foods, but yeah, they've Gene's been a hallmark in that Chambers County country for now. It's hard to believe, going on 50 years.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, here's another one from the Joe Legault tree that has got an interesting backstory of how he ended up hooking up with Joe, and that's Jack Holland.
Yeah. Yeah. Jack used to poach the backside of bears thinking he could get away with it till Joe caught him and became, one of the premier guides there on the Bear Ranch. Jack was a very, very good duck hunter.
And he was from Louisiana, correct?
I don't really know. I know he was actually his quote real job was he was a teacher up here in the Humble area.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
I know that's if you look at the list of the bear guides, Jack lived in Humble,
Right.
which I can relate to because I was right there in Kingwood,
Right.
And but he also hunted Lake Conroe and the Trinity Bottoms as well as the marsh. So he was pretty diverse in what he did. And let's see. Here's one that this man we've talked about, and you've got a special heirloom from his collection. That's Morgan LaFour.
Yeah, Morgan LaFour was not a lot of people probably have heard of him because he was you got to remember some of this stuff happened 60, 70 years ago now. But Morgan LaFour, his family had lived in the Trinity River bottom country for generations. He started out market gunning. I think market hunting was illegal by then, but he was still doing it, as a lot of people were back in that country. But ended up becoming a guide in the Lower Trinity, hunting the Lake Charlotte country back in there, and took a lot of Houston area people hunting. Morgan was incredible shot. Bob Brister, actually, there's Bob Brister, the former outdoor writer at the Chronicle and shooting editor for Field and Stream, who I was lucky enough to work with for several years. Brister's book Shotgunning the Art and Science has a photograph of Morgan LaFour in it. Bob said that Morgan was one of the best shots he'd ever seen. He could consistently kill 2 passing birds with one shot. And when Bob said somebody was a good shot, he knew what he was talking about.
Isn't that the truth? And still to this day, The Art and Science is one of the greatest shotgunning books ever written, in my opinion.
I agree. It was groundbreaking at the time and still is.
Still is.
And particularly waterfowl hunters today could learn a lot from reading that book.
Exactly. Yeah, I would encourage anybody in the audience. You want to shoot better? Read that book by Bob Brister and follow what he says, and you will hit more targets. There's no doubt about that. But I got to see this at Spread Oaks. You've got one of Morgan's old Model 12.
Right. It just so happens, my family knew the LaFour family, and long story really short, my brother Les and I ended up finding Morgan LaFour's, I think it was 1948 Model 12 field grade shotgun for sale online with his with Morgan's nameplate on the gun. And we now end up, both of us shoot Morgan's Model 12 occasionally, and I hope to shoot it this weekend.
Is there a better pointing shotgun than the Model 12?
I don't think there is. I like my Wingmaster, but that Model 12, had I had enough money when I was young, I would have bought a Model 12.
Exactly. And folks, Shannon was talking about his 870 Wingmaster, and that he bought in 1969 and still shoots to this day. And I got the chance to see it, and it's one of those, truly a gun you can look at and wish it would tell you what it's been through. It could talk, right? That 1969 Wingmaster is just, to me, is one of the great waterfowling guns I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I've just never had I never found the need to get another one. It does exactly what I want it to do, and the only time it's broke was when it broke a firing pin. So,
yeah, one of my all-time favorite guns as well, the 870 Wingmaster. It's a classic. That's all you can really say about it. And
I grew up around those folks shooting, incredible guns. Crack Corn Jackson shot a 410 Model 42.
42, yeah.
The guy was just incredibly deadly with it. And we talked about that. A lot of people would be surprised at how good guys were. And a classic example of that is, real quickly, one of the market hunters at Lake Surprise, a guy named Forrest McNear, ended up writing an autobiography. It's one of the most incredible books I've ever read. It's called Forrest McNear of Texas. He was a market hunter for Moody back in the 1890s, 1900. He ended up becoming one of the best trap shots in the U.S., was the first Texan to win a gold medal in the Olympics for trap shooting in 1920 in Belgium, and is in the Trap Shooting Hall of Fame. That's how good a shots some of these waterfowl guides were.
Yeah, exactly. They started out shooting to live, and that kind of makes you better than most people.
Exactly.
You didn't have money to waste ammo, right?
Exactly, but you could learn a lot by just watching some of those guys.
Gotcha. And here's a name that is part of the Baytown lore for sure. Great decoy carver, Rudy LeCompte.
Rudy LeCompte, actually from Louisiana, but made his name in Baytown he was a waterfowl hunter, but carved some of the most incredible decoys. And that was the other thing about Baytown. It was the center of decoy carving in the state of Texas. There were a handful of carvers, just incredibly first-rate people, Rudy LeCompte being one of them, probably the premier decoy carver in Texas. If you collect decoys and you're looking for a Texas decoy, there are the premier decoys are LeCompte's. There were 5 or 6 carvers in this area. Amos Tilton being another one from Old River, but Rudy LeCompte and a handful of folks who he mentored are the premier collectible decoy carvers in Texas.
I got you. Here's another Baytown name, more famous, I think, for a sporting goods store, and that's Jim Nelson.
Jim Nelson Sporting Goods in Baytown was kind of the center of the universe when I was a kid. And Jim Nelson, I guess his claim to fame really is he and a couple other guys in Baytown developed the white spread. They were the first ones to come up with using. I think they first started using newspapers, but then they switched to diapers, which those of us who used diapers as rags back in the day cringe when we think about. But yeah, he developed the white spread for goose hunting, and he introduced it to the west side of Houston, where it really took off.
Most people think that it all started over there for the white goose hunting and stuff, but it was Jim Nelson and his cronies that started the white spread right there in Baytown.
Right here in Baytown, and we used it. It just became standard operating procedure. Prior to that, you used silhouettes or shells, and you could never put out more than maybe 100 decoys. But with white spreads, once you switched from diapers to to banquet cloth and then to socks, it was a game changer for the goose hunting community in all of Texas and the U.S. probably.
It did, and it allowed you to put out 800, 1,000 decoys in a short amount of time. 4 or 5 guys, right. Man, you could have them out in 20, 25 minutes. I mean, that was a mainstay of what we did as guys, on the west side.
Right,
was the windsock, and they still work. And a lot of people, if you could get your hands on some, you should try them, because those snows haven't seen that decoy in a long time. They've seen the newer style sock, but to me, the old windsock, it just looks better. It's bigger and it just waddles more naturally.
I think it moves different. Yeah. You're right.
And they haven't seen it in 2 decades or more now. A lot of them haven't. So it works. I use them from time to time, and it's really a game changer sometimes on those birds, because they even with adults, they have never they haven't even seen it.
Right, but that was that's just kind of indicative of the culture I grew up in there in Baytown. It was
innovators too, yeah.
Right, that and just. Waterfowl was everything to so many of those people, and the premier duck calls in Texas back then were made over in Port Arthur or Groves, actually.
That's another guy I was about to bring up, Cowboy Fernandez.
Yep, everybody blew a Jensen. Everybody blew that double reed Jensen. That some of us were contrary and went with the triple reed just because I liked that. It wasn't as loud, but sounded more like a model duck to me, which is what I really wanted. And,
right, yeah.
Those Jensen double reeds were and believe it or not, Falks from Lake Charles were probably the premier calls, or the most commonly used calls. On that east side back then.
We did a great DU Nation segment with Falk's calls, and the guy who's been sitting there making those calls for going on 40 years. Check that out. If you haven't seen it, it's really it's really pretty cool. I mean, same little shop that they've been in forever.
Right
there.
Right. But yeah, there were the Jensen, those Sure Shot double reeds were hanging on everybody's neck.
Oh, I know it. I mean, that was the call.
Right.
You know, I had the double reed version, which I don't know where it is. I can't believe I don't have it. Yeah, I mean, that was the call on the Texas coast was the Jensen. That was period. You know.
Right.
I mean, you would see some Haydale's calls, you know, coming in too, but the Jensen was king. And hey, if people want to buy them, they're still out there in business. I mean, they've just got new ownership, and I think they're doing pretty well.
You bet. But that was, just indicative of kind of the culture that was over there on that east side. It was waterfowl was a major. Waterfowl and wetlands were in everybody's blood over there.
Still are. Like I said, I know Ducks Unlimited has done a lot of work all around Texas, really trying to restore a lot of the habitat that's been lost, bring it back to, what its former glory and really, keep those traditions alive. We've really worked hard to do that. Here's a name. Everybody in the Houston area knew this guy's name back in those days, and he had some very interesting dogs that he used to run. And that's Forrest West.
Forrest was larger than life. One of the more fascinating men I ever met in my life. I actually did a few guide trips for him back in the day too. So, but yeah, Forrest was an interesting man. Kind of straddled the world between the timber hunting and the coastal hunting. He guided on. I met him through one of my friend's fathers worked with him at Diamond Shamrock Refinery before Forrest gave that up and became a guide full time. Grew up around Forrest, actually leased some property from Forrest, and he was the stories that both Bob Brister and Joe Doggett wrote in the Houston Chronicle about Forrest kind of introduced him to the world. But Forrest was one of the best shots, one of the best duck hunters, one of the best duck callers I ever met in my life. His son, Jim, continues to guide to this day. But, Forrest had outsized personality. His dogs did too, and they reflected their master. He had one named Bo, who was probably, close to 100 pounds. But Bo is an incredible dog, but had a temper. Kind of like Forrest, and would occasionally just decide that he would pick up any duck, but occasionally he would decide to eat one. And
yeah, that's what I heard about Bo. And don't mess with Bo. When he was working.
Right. Don't mess with Bo, just like you never messed with Forrest. You would draw back a nub, as my dad would say. But the confrontations between Forrest and Bo were legendary. Two very confrontational people.
That's right. They were made for each other, Most folks wouldn't, they would have gotten rid of a dog like that. But exactly. Forrest hunted him every day,
Right. And he was an incredible dog. You let him do his job and don't get your hand too close.
That's right. I want to close it out with a couple of names. You've mentioned them already. A couple of guys you worked with who both wrote a lot about the East Side, and like I said, who were along with you. I read just about everything that they ever wrote in the Chronicle, I think. And the first one is Joe Doggett.
Joe, probably one of the best pure writers I ever met in my life. Could tell a story. And I think he loved the characters that he met and tried and did just a heck of a job in translating that to the word and entertaining and informing readers. And that's what our job was about. That's what our job was about. I worked with Joe for 17, 18 years before he retired. And I learned a lot from him. Enjoyed reading his work, and like I said, he's one of the best storytellers I've ever run into.
And the second name we talked about his book is his knowledge of shotgunning, the legendary Bob Brister.
Right. It was a real honor and pleasure to work with Bob. Spend some time with him. He like like me, grew up in a small waterfowling community. I mean, he grew up in East Texas, in Marshall. And I learned a ton from him. And as a matter of fact, between him, Hart Stillwell, a couple of other writers, certainly influenced me in my career, probably as much or more than anybody else. It was a heck of a shot, a heck of an innovator. Like I said, that book, his shotgunning book, is second to none. And for folks who are just interested, he did a book with Jack Cowan called The Golden Crescent, which is a compilation of paintings, Cowan paintings, and Brister stories. So fiction or semi-fiction in some cases, but if people would read that, they'd get a lot of insight into Bob Brister and into the world that he lived through. But I was really lucky to be able to work with those guys, and the great thing about I guess the staff at the Chronicle was we were all different. We all had our different points of view and our different interests, and I think that's what made it interesting to the readers. Is it wasn't all the same.
Right. And another guy that I can't leave out, but I want to get him on for his own podcast. We're going to dive deep into the West Side, and that's Doug Pike.
Sure.
Doug, I interviewed him for an article I wrote in Wildfowl on called The Snowmen. He's talking about the development of snow guides on the West Side, and he's another guy that was a guide over there, and really talked about it. But I know, just the little bit of time I've spent with him, he had to have been, another one of those, great characters.
Oh yeah. It like I said, it was interesting. It was a really interesting dynamic, and we all went our own ways. We very seldom coordinated anything, but we all had our different areas of interest. And I think that's what made it interesting to readers, and at least I hope it did. And I enjoyed, I think I worked with Doug for probably 17, 18 years. But yeah, it was always an interesting world. And people think you always, you work with people you spend a lot of time with. We never really got to spend that much time together, but in the field, but we did in the office. And but we shared a lot of the same contacts, and it was an interesting world, and I'm glad I was part of it. I'm glad I'm still a part of it.
Yeah, man, I'm glad you're a part of it. Like I said, we got to live a lot of that through your writing, man. It was really, really great stuff. I just want to close this out with you, Shannon. Just something we do with a lot of folks. Just throughout all those years, just think back, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but just think about one of the most memorable hunts that you ever had. In your lifetime on the East Side. Does one hunt in particular ever jump out at you?
Oh boy, it's just a whirlwind of.
Yeah, I know it's hard for me too, man. I can't really think of one, but it's let's narrow it down. A snow goose hunt.
A snow goose hunt. Barrows Marsh, probably. I don't know, 74, 75. People don't realize that a lot of people don't realize snow goose spend their whole winter in the marsh until rice came along. In the late part of the year, geese would get back in the marsh and start hitting that three-corner grass, get back in the deep marsh, and they'd be on feeds back in there. And I remember one morning humping into the marsh. They were on a feed on the backside of Barrow Ranch, in three-corner grass, and me and 3 or 4 other guys humped rags through that marsh back out and set up around a bunch of muskrat mounds. And we had probably one of the most incredible goose shoots I've ever had in my life. It was a foggy day, but it still had a little wind, which is really rare. Usually fog, you don't have any wind. But we had a good south wind and fog. The geese would just come out of the fog, right hanging right over the decoys, and it was probably the best goose shoot I've ever had in my life. Birds at 20 yards with us leaning up against muskrat mounds in the marsh. But I also remember that hunt having to carry all those birds out. And
that was brutal. Just getting in there was brutal. Carrying them out was worse.
This was back in the day of the five goose limit. Trust me, 5 geese. We also shot, several ducks too.
Yeah. Pintails would love those spreads.
Right. Pintails would work those spreads, particularly back in that marsh. And so 5 geese and 5 or 6 ducks and a bunch of soaked rags in the Barrow Marsh. I remember the pain, but I remember the pleasure too. It was cost-benefit analysis. I came out ahead.
That's right. That's right, man. It's hard to describe. Once again, to people, sink it up to your knees might be, a way that you could say that you could talk about that mud out there.
Yeah. Duck hunting's almost always been a young man's sport, and you do not find a lot of hardcore duck hunters past about 60, and that's the reason. But yeah, that was probably one of the best goose hunts I ever was on in my life, and just with a handful of good friends in an incredible place. And just one of those mornings you can close your eyes and see 50 years later.
Man, incredible, Shannon. Man, I can't thank you enough for being on the Ducks Unlimited podcast, man. It's been great talking about these people and places. It's unbelievable.
Hey, John, thank you. You have to realize that there are dozens and dozens of places like that around this country where there are people whose lives are hugely influenced by those birds and those wetlands that they live around. And
that's right.
I was just lucky enough to grow up in one.
Yeah, that's it. All of this exists because there's ducks and geese in the world.
Right.
And people that love to hunt them.
It's those birds and it's those places that make it what it is. So let's hope we can keep them.
Let's hope we can keep them. That's our mission, to fill the skies with waterfowl today, tomorrow, and forever. That's what we're trying to do here at Ducks Unlimited for sure.
Well, keep up the great work. We need it.
Appreciate it. Well, once again, folks, thanks for tuning into the DU podcast, and thanks for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.